when you're in conflict with your partner or a person in general, and you feel yourself becoming dysregulated and reactive, and you start tapping into some of the John Gottman four horsemen, might become contemptuous, or you might become defensive, or maybe your response is stonewalling, or maybe it's criticizing your partner who you care and love and cherish. Or maybe you don't do that. But if you do, if you're like me and you have a tendency of becoming maybe a little reactive, how does one identify that? How does one work with that within themselves? And how does one recover that to find clarity and refine love towards their partner and towards themselves?
Man, if we could figure that out as individuals, then we could figure it out en masse, and then we could solve the challenges of the world. Because you think about collectively, as we move as human systems, our nervous systems are so dysregulated. So, it's such a great question, because I think before we even ask the question as individuals, it's usually because the result of our reactivity has caused disruptions in our relationships. Conflict that just seems to repeat itself, and relationship patterns that seem to repeat themselves, and not just within our own relationships, but we then start to see, if we look up the family tree, that this same behavior of how to navigate conflict is living itself out with me. Or I just happen to do the opposite as some sort of compensatory strategy to never be like my parents. And then I just become the opposite, which isn't healthy.
Yeah.
So that first part is the recognition of the results you create relationally, because, then we don't have to look far to see, as you said, the four horsemen, which for those of you listening, it's, there are 4 behaviors that are predictive of divorce when done in high quantity. But I think the interesting thing, when I first learned about the four horsemen, is I was like, damn, I do that. Shit, I've done that. Is that it's normal to have protective mechanisms to try to maintain some sense of connection to ourselves, to the other person. It's just the problem is that usually those mechanisms that are dysfunctional communication-wise, they're built on top. Their intention is to try to protect us, but they actually just repeat the patterns of harm in communication. So the first, yes, recognizing how you show up in communication. And then I think pathologizing it is important. I don't think it's necessary. You don't have to know where your defensiveness comes from. You don't have to know where your stonewalling comes from to know that you don't want to do it again. But I'd say you probably don't have to look very far to see that's probably your family system. And then it's really, there's the skill set part of it, which is learning how to structure language and how to master that. There's the nervous system part of that, which for me, meditation and things like breath work have allowed that moment between the stimulus, my partner criticizing me, and my response getting defensive, that space now is much longer. 1 second feels like 3 or 4 seconds. And, I've been thinking about, when you're in it, it's really hard to say, right now I feel activated. But that's actually where we hope to get to, is actually to the place that there's the observation of the activation and then a choice about the behavior. But you have to have the skill set of the new behavior too.
Yeah, you can say it, but it doesn't necessarily change it.
Right. Because I can know I get
still saying it
defensive,
with
but
the
what's
mind.
the solution?
Yeah.
And there are antidotes to each of those. So like criticism is really starting sentences with like, you always, you never. Behind every criticism isn't actually a desired behavior. It's just that we usually learn that criticism is a way to create connection. So if we had criticizing parents, we watched our mom or our dad constantly nag on the other person. Criticism, the antidote to it is saying things like, hey, in my experience, so you're now taking ownership for your own experience. You're leaving space for someone else's experience. When this happens, this is how I feel. So there's I language. Criticism pairs perfectly with defensiveness or stonewalling. Defensiveness, I'm a recovering defender. So like for me, I get defensive. And defensiveness at its core is really trying to protect delicate self-worth. Low self-worth, like we don't want, if someone gives me feedback and I correlate their feedback to my self-worth, then I won't be able to hear it. What you're saying means I'm not a good person. Oh, I let you down. Oh, there I go again. And because I haven't been able to look at maybe the ways I let myself down, the ways I haven't shown up, I'm reacting actually to that, not to them. And the antidote to defensiveness is a tough one, man. It's like eating your own shoe. A really good way to start is to say, I can see some truth in what you're saying. Oh, it's such a beautiful reception of what is being shared, because there usually is some small amount of truth or maybe a large amount of truth in what someone's saying to us. And we're talking about all of this out of the context of abusive relationships. Those are totally different cat. But with this, it's like, hey, you're late. And when you're late, this is how it impacts me. And, oh, you want to talk about late? Let's talk about that time, right? So defensiveness really is about raising the level of the conflict, but also flipping it. Contempt is the greatest predictor of divorce. The greatest predictive behavior of divorce is eye rolling. And I remember teaching that at a workshop, and someone rolled their eyes in the first row, like, oh yeah, okay. And I'm like, divorced. Like it's interesting. We don't see hierarchy. Contempt is really creating hierarchies. So it's making a face of disgust at our partner. You see contempt in very long relationships that have not navigated hurts. The ruptures have not been repaired. And so it's just this build up and build up. And in the data, contempt is actually hard to rescue a couple from because there's so much built. I think it takes a really skilled therapist or coach because there's so much atonement that needs to happen. Yeah. And the partner who has continuously, let's say, been hurt, they have to want to. And I'd say there's such a deep fracture of trust that can be really hard to come back from. It's possible, but it's challenging. And the last one, stonewalling, is like, hey, shutting down, withdrawing, ghosting, hanging up the phone, leaving the room. If you look at the core of that behavior, it's really an inability to co-regulate from a nervous system perspective. If you think about criticism, there's an inability, usually where these behaviors kind of stack on what we would call like anxious attachment or avoidant attachment. So like anxious people who really chase or that maybe take the pursuer role in relationship, they have an inability to self-regulate. So they're pursuing as a way to try to regulate with another person. Avoidantly attached people who distance, shut down, stonewall, which tends to be more male. And that's developmental, like the ways that we're shaped emotionally and the way society treats us, the way, we navigate emotion. We have a harder time co-regulating.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot safer for me to be an island than, to share that space with someone else. So ideally to heal stonewalling, if that is something that you listening, you struggle with, it's actually to try to take less time from the withdrawal, because someone might be like, I can't talk right now. I don't want to. They leave. Really in a relationship that's looking to grow from that, they would say, hey, I'm going to go for an hour and I'm going to come back. Yep. And the rule is that you have to make it can't take longer than 24 hours because usually the person who's being left in that moment, they probably have an abandonment wound. And so their growth is to let you go. Your growth is to come back. And the reason we say no longer than 24 hours is because otherwise you'll be in a session 10 years later and you'll bring it up because some people will never come back to the subject, right? I used to do that when I was younger. Be like, we'll talk about it later. Never.